All right, we've been looking at the topic of anti-Semitism, which is going to lead into anti-Semitism in the New Testament, and then that's going to morph into anti-Semitism within Christianity. So last week, just briefly reviewing, this was kind of the focus of last week's discussion, was anti-Semitism in the New Testament. This is an article from Wikipedia. You can go online and find this. We were looking at the bottom of this, let's see if we got this pointer, there we go. Down here, there is, you can see 1, 2, 3. It got chopped off, but there was more than that. We went through each one of the points as to why critics of Christianity, or just simply scholars looking back as to the origin of anti-Semitism, why they point the finger at Christianity and in particular the New Testament. We went through the points asking for feedback along the way. The article also highlights John chapter 8 and also 1 Thessalonians, I think it's chapter 4, and I don't have it off the top of my head, which clearly associate the Jewish people with being offspring of the devil and also laying the death of Jesus upon the Jewish people. So what I wanted to do last week, and it didn't work, we didn't have all the technology working for us. Here's the First Thessalonians 2, and here's the link. Not only was it blaming the death of Jesus upon the Jews, it says there in verse 14, for you suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they did from the Jews who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets. And then if you continue into the subsequent verses 17 and 18, it makes reference to Paul wanting to come to the Thessalonians, but again, Satan hindered us. And we talked about the link between the Jewish people and this adversary, Satan, here in verse 18. Then we looked at John 8. This passage here, you can see highlighted in yellow, where Jesus says, you are of your father the devil. And who's he talking about? Well, I made this little sandwich chart showing you for chapter 8, you had verse 13 of reference to the Pharisees, but then all of a sudden, John uses the term the Jews in verse 22 and then 31. So Jesus said to the Jews. Verse 44 is where we have this rather controversial statement, you are of your father the devil. And then 44, John goes back to the Jews answered. 52, the Jews said to him. And 57, so the Jews said to him. So we have the Jewish people being associated here in John 8 with the devil. Then in Revelation, we looked at chapters 2 and 3, where there were some who said they were Jews, but they were not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. That happens basically twice, once in Revelation 2, once in Revelation 3. And with that, we tried to last week that didn't work. This week, it's a little bit premature. This video is of a rabbi who actually brings up 2 of the 3 passages that we just looked at last week. And you'll see from the standpoint of a Jew how they read. We had this discussion. We were hesitant to associate, quote, the phrase the Jews with being the ones who killed Jesus, because only a select number of Jews were responsible. But as you saw in John chapter 8, for some reason in John, the term the Jews is being used ultra-liberally And this has ramifications, and you'll see in this video, this rabbi actually brings this out. So he's going to cover the 1 Thessalonians passage, he's going to cover the John chapter 8 passage. So this, I think, is about 6 minutes long. It wasn't working last week, but it looks like it's working this week. I'll get the mic.
Just a really quick question, and I don't know if you know the answer, if anyone does. What, and obviously this would be a guess, but what percentage of the Jews in Israel at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus probably believed in Jesus?
Who believed Jesus was Messiah?
Yes.
I guess it all depends what time you ask that question, because initially they thought this was clearly, the prophets that Moses spoke about. But the fact that when Jesus came into Jerusalem there, what was it, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And even the disciples said, we thought, he was the one who was going to deliver Israel. So I guess, just like politics, it all depends which way the wind's blowing and how strong. But clearly the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were against him almost right from the very get-go. Even, they were antagonistic to John the Baptist. So they weren't going to look favorably upon whom, he was foretelling. But I wouldn't be able to know. I just would say, I'm pretty certain that it all depends on what time of day, which way the wind's blowing, and whether we're talking about the triumphal entry. Is that the term? I'm trying to remember that day when he comes riding on the foal of an ass. So it all depends what time you're talking about. And like all human beings, Jews, just like us, are fickle. We can be pro fill in the blank today, and tomorrow we're anti fill in the blank. All right, let's see if we can get this video going here.
Well, let's go to the very earliest letter of Paul. And it is probably the oldest surviving Christian literature, and that's the 1 Thessalonians, no doubt written by the hand of Paul. Age, like 49, 50, that's really, really early, right? And there's no debate over its authorship. So Paul, in chapter 2, verse 14 through 16, just blames the Jews for killing Jesus, and the Jews are therefore contrary to all mankind. And he's not writing this to Jews, so no, not at all. Paul's letters are almost always written to non-Jews, not to Jewish people. There is an exception, and that's in the book of Romans, where he is addressing both groups, I mean Jews and Gentiles who are Christians, to a church that he has not yet visited. He will, but when he's writing Romans, he had not yet been to Rome. So I could dismiss it in that fashion, but it's much, much deeper than this. The Jews are portrayed as the devil in the Christian Bible, and it's a very serious charge, but it's a very sophisticated charge. And most people look at passages like John 8:44, where the Jews who don't believe are called the seed of the devil. Satan is your father. And they go, well, that's a really nasty thing to say. But people don't really grasp, they just don't wrap their head around what the charge is here. And it's rather sophisticated. In Christian thought, Satan, the devil, does he know the truth? No matter what you're doing, stop and listen to what I'm about to share with you.
So I want to clarify that he is speaking of mainstream Christianity here with respect to the devil and Satan. We are of a different sort, where we have a different perspective on the term Satan and devil. We actually would align with the rabbinic, the Jewish interpretation. He's speaking, though, of mainstream Christianity, so just keep that in mind as he goes through the story about the devil.
You cannot miss this point. In Christian theology, does Satan know the truth? I mean, really know that God is who he is and Jesus Christ is his son? The answer is yes, he very much does know. But he rejects Jesus anyway, and he rejects God anyway, because he is the chief enemy of God, because he went into rebellion against God because of his pride. This has nothing to do with Judaism. This is pure dualism.
That's what I'm referring to.
Okay? I'm not going to get into the Judaism view of Satan, but right now understand this, that in the Christian view, Satan was the highest of all the angels. And he went into rebellion, and it all plays out in Revelation, how it all ends up, okay? Revelation 13 and so on. So when you say that the Jews are the seed of the devil, this is not like just using, saying some pejorative thing about Jews, What you are saying is the following. Jews deep down know that Jesus is the Messiah. They really deep down believe in Christ, but they reject him anyway. Only the devil can do that. And it is for this reason that people who have a unflattering view of the Jews, Christians who view the Jews with contempt, they're not insane. Christian anti-Semitism is completely rational. If you read the Christian Bible and the way the Jews are portrayed, they're not portrayed as people who just don't know any better. It's not like, they were just people who happened to be in China at the time and just didn't know about it. So they're not angry at them. They didn't know, that's why I don't believe. But the Jews deep down know. In fact, we know it so well that we even infuse Christologies into our custom. Like we have 3 matzahs at the Passover Seder for the Holy Trinity, which we claim not to believe in. And we put holes in our matzahs because we know that Christ was pierced through. And we break the middle matzah because the second person of the Trinity was broken. Okay? This is the way the Jews are portrayed in the Christian Bible. It's not they just don't believe. It's not just that they don't know no, the Jews really know the truth, but they reject him anyways, and only the devil can do that. And this theme flows throughout. This reaches a height. There are so many examples of this, but this is all over the place in the Christian Bible, where the Jews are portrayed not as just not knowing, and the reason why no one would ever buy this is the Jews have a reputation for being clever, knowing the Bible. They're the only ones who can read the Bible in its original language. We're the only ones who were there at the time. The Japanese were not in the land of Israel. Why don't we believe it? It has to be that they're enemies of God. This is and the way racism, bigotry is conveyed, is not by saying, we think the blacks are this, the Jews are this, and using all kinds of words. No, the way hatred is conveyed is through storytelling. If you just use an inappropriate term to speak about any group of people, that's not what makes people embrace a worldview of that person. It's the storytelling that creates racism. Always. Bigotry is always created by storytelling. They're not crazy. The reason why they think this is the Christian worldview. And this is why Buddhists don't hate Jews. This is why Hindus, there's no history of anti-Semitism in India. Why? Because the Hindus have not been loaded with this kind of screed that portrays the Jews as devils. So what I'm seeking to convey here is that the anti-Semitism found in the Christian Bible is not something that Jews are all kinds of whatever. No, it's the storytelling. The storytelling is what creates a bigotry in good people who would otherwise who would be philo-Semitic, and it makes them have a dark view. It nourishes within them a dark view of the Jews, although in every other way they're perfectly moral people, because of the way the storytelling is conveyed in the Christian canon. Bingo, there it is.
Okay, I thought that was an interesting video, is why I shared it with you. And this is telling the situation from the perspective of a Jew, which we cannot put ourselves in their shoes. And I think there's a couple points that he brings up which are very valid. You don't become a bigot just because you hear someone say of another person, your mother wears army boots. You become a bigot toward a person or their race, class of people because of a story, a narrative. And he's pointing back to the Christian Bible, the New Testament, in particular the gospel, although, again, 1 Thessalonians jumps out. I think he over-exaggerates when he says it's all over the Christian Bible. But I do think as we're reading the Bible, we're not sensitive to things that a Jewish person would be sensitive of. So I wanted to share his perspective of that. Now, again, I'm sharing this with you again for many reasons, but it also backs up this particular article here, which levels this criticism against Christians, against the New Testament, and you can see where the authors and the critics are coming from after you've seen that video. Hopefully that was helpful. Okay, so if you were to continue reading this, Robert?
Just going to say that we're not. He's portraying Christians as the misbelief of who the devil is in the Christian church, and it goes. That's I think why maybe we as believing what we believe, we don't see that as much because we don't believe the devil is a person. We believe it's
It depends on the context. You'd have to read the context to figure out who the Satan, the adversary is, which is literally what the word means.
Right. But my point is, it goes to show you that what we believe does matter, and how a misbelief can really do a lot of harm.
Exactly.
If indeed this is your point, that Christians are anti-Semitic, and this is the root of it. The root of it is your misunderstanding of who the devil is.
Right. You're right and you're wrong in that, and it's not your fault. Where I am, and you'll see later on, I'll try to clarify, anti-Semitism is not the term we should be using for what we see in John chapter 8 or in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. That's not anti-Semitism. I've been using the term only because I'm trying to lead up to the need for another term, and we'll get there. But everything, other than that, what you said was spot on. It's not anti-Semitism that we're seeing. However, this term that I'm going to lead you to, they're all related. And again, if you don't have a proper worldview or understanding of the scriptures, as you're pointing out, Robert, it affects other things. It affects how you treat people, affects how you see a group of people. Our theology affects how we think, speak, and act. And I'll bring that up again later. So this article also takes John chapter 8 to task. And it was interesting, when you look at John, particularly, we got into this last week, something you'll notice when you compare John with the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. I had mentioned last week, if you were to go, I've got this up here, if you had an electronic Bible and you typed in the phrase, quote unquote, the Jews, and you said, just show me all I guess you could do now artificial intelligence, you can say ChatGPT, show me all the verses in the Gospel of Matthew where the phrase the Jews shows up. And this is what you would get. And there's nothing in these passages that are all anti-anything. It's just talking about, where is he who was born king of the Jews? And then when Pilate was dealing with Jesus, he asked the question, are you king of the Jews? And then the last one, talking about the rumors to what happened to the body of the Jesus, and there was a rumor spread among the Jews to this day. So that's all the places where you'll find the term the Jews in Matthew. If you do the same exercise in Mark, you'll get these, pretty much the same thing, except for there's one here, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat until they wash their hands. And then we get back to the Pilate passages. Again, there's nothing anti-anything. There's nothing negative in the sense of derogatory or bigotry or racist in these. If you do the same exercise in Luke, you get even fewer. We have a reference to when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent him to the elders of the Jews. and then Pilate again, the passage dealing with the King of the Jews. Matthew, Mark, Luke, if you do an exercise, search for the term the Jews, no problem. You would have to then, you tell whoever wrote that article about anti-Semitism in the New Testament, I don't see what you're complaining about for Matthew, Mark, Luke. But when you get to the book of John, something happens. You do the same exercise for the phrase the Jews, you'll find over 60 instances where the term the Jews shows up. And if you go through them one by one, you'll find about half of them, there's something antagonistic in the context where you find the term the Jews. And a greater question is why? Why is John treating or using this phrase the Jews in in a hostile manner compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Now, I'll just leave that question in the back of your head, but let's go through these passages one by one. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, it is the Sabbath day, it is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. So here we have a confrontation of the religious leaders saying, taking issue with the miracle that Jesus had performed. It is confrontational, it's antagonistic. You're coming across with the opinion that these people, the Jews, are unreasonable and being really, getting bent out of shape over something they should be rejoicing over. Next passage, and therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him. Very clearly, we've got an antagonistic, hostile context. Next one, therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him because he had not only broken the Sabbath, but said that God was his father. Clearly, we have antagonism here in the context where we have the phrase, the Jews. And it goes on and on and on. John chapter 7, verse 1, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry because the Jews sought to kill him. So you remember a couple weeks back, I had asked how many people here would lay the blame, the responsibility upon Jesus' death upon the Jews, and very few people raised their hand. In John, you're seeing this, Randy, you pointed out in Book of Acts, I pointed out in 1 Thessalonians 4, but in John, you're finding this repeatedly, that the term the Jews, however you wish to, we can get into that debate as to what it doesn't mean everyone among the Jewish people. It doesn't really make any difference. When it's put down in parchment and the story is told as the rabbi has shared, the Jews are being associated with being the killer or killers of Jesus. All right, next one, howbeit no man spake openly of him, of Jesus, for fear of the Jews. Again, a very dark context. Then said the Jews unto him, thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham? Again, we have the religious leaders butting heads with Jesus, but John is describing it as the Jews. John chapter 9, these words spake of his parents because they feared the Jews. This is the blind man the parents were called and they were afraid to testify what actually happened. And here we have the Jews being the reason why they were afraid. John chapter 10, and then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. Pretty antagonistic. The Jews answered him, saying, for a good work we stone thee not. Again, can't get much hostile than that. John chapter 11, his disciples say unto him, Master, the Jews have late sought to stone thee. That speaks for itself. John 19, and from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend, etc., etc. John 19, again, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. There's something dark and sinister about the Jews. John chapter 20, then the same day at evening, being at the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled, for fear of the Jews. All right, so we'll stop there. That's all the passages in John. Now, isn't that striking? Matthew, Mark, Luke, nothing derogatory, hostile, antagonistic, dark, sinister at all. John, over half the time you find the phrase the Jews, you have this tension that's being polite. You have hostility. Why is that? Anyone want to take any guesses? Jacob?
Just spitballing out here. What if it's partly due to the fact that John had a more intimate relationship with the leaders, and he would have potentially have known their inner thoughts, and would have, because I mean, it's believed that John is the one who's the disciple who Jesus loves, or who he never refers to himself personally, but he's the one who's able to get access to the actual part, but to the temple when Jesus is taken in to get trial. He was the one who's able to get in there. I'm curious if he is he has a little level of animosity against what would have been his friends or his very close brethren that were not accepting or not getting what Jesus was trying to get at. And so there was a potential level of animosity in John's eyes towards these people who were like, come on, you guys should have known this. You and I read the same Bible. You should have seen what Jesus is supposed to be. And so when they are going contrary to what he would have hoped them to do, he then just has a little bit of a bite to it.
Does that explain why John only is the one who's showing this phenomenon?
I think for John it was more personable than for Luke or Matthew and Mark. Because for John, he himself had, it seems like at least a position involved with the whole temple.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have an answer. I could guess that it may have something to do with the time that the book of John was written, that if there was greater persecution against the Christians at the time that John was writing, it may not have been intentional. If I would imagine if John were here today and we were to talk to him and say, look at what's happened as a result of the very loose, careless way the term the Jews has been used, I'm sure he would be sorrowful to see what has happened. The fact is, we do have this term being used, and unfortunately, it's built in or it becomes part of the narrative when you tell the story from the book of John, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. And that becomes part of the story. Now, we're pretty educated people, but there are people who are simpler and will try to simplify a complex situation, and then things can sometimes spread out of control. Again, I'm sure John was not anti-Semitic, and the reason is John was a Jew. It's like me saying, as a capitalist, I'm anti-capitalism. You can't. If you're a Jew, you can't be anti-Semitic, but you can be something else. And I might just jump ahead to that. Although I will say, let's get back up. So what's interesting too is it happens in Acts, which is puzzling because Luke was the one who wrote supposedly the book of Acts, and yet we don't find this phenomenon in the book of Luke. Again, it could be that the timing when Acts was written was a later date when persecution against the Christians was being more and more attributed to the Jewish people. I don't know. That's the best I could come up as to why you find this. But I'm going to skip over this. These are the instances in Acts, and there's quite a few, where the Jews are again singled out in a very hostile or negative, dark context. Okay, so this is why what we're seeing here in John, in Acts, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, why what we're seeing here is not, I wish Robert was here so he could see what I'm talking about. Anyway, anti-Semitism is hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against the Jews. Anti-Semitism is widely considered to be a form of racism. And that point is why what we're seeing here in the Bible is not anti-Semitism. It's not that these portrayals of quote unquote the Jews are because of race. It's because of something else. And that's what I'm trying to work up to here. So I might as well spill the beans. I wish again Robert was here. We'll backtrack on this next week. So this is the term that should be used to describe what we're seeing in John 8, or actually just half the references in John to the Jews, what we're finding in Acts, which we skipped over, why we see the Jews being described by Paul as being antagonistic to his preaching. The term is anti-Judaism. Okay, so we have had in this whatever many weeks, 3-4 weeks, we've had several terms thrown at us. We've had anti-Semitism, which we saw is based upon race. There's also the term anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is the opposition to the return of the Jewish people to Palestine. So you can actually be anti-Zionist, but not be anti-Semitic. And make sure you can distinguish the differences between the two. You can be anti-Zionist and not be anti-Semitic. But now we have a new term that we need to bring forward because anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism doesn't explain what we're seeing in the New Testament. What we're seeing is anti-Judaism. And in a nutshell, anti-Judaism is the opposition to Judaism. To be more specific, anti-Judaism has to do with the opposition to the Jewish way of life and the practice of the historic Jewish religion. So I'll repeat that because it's important. Anti-Judaism is the opposition to Judaism. To be more specific, anti-Judaism has to do with the opposition to the Jewish way of life and the practice of the historic Jewish religion. Okay. Any questions about that? We need to make sure we have these terms nailed down so we don't get things confused. And this is why when I was responding to Robert, he was using this word anti-Semitism. That's not correct. We're talking about anti-Judaism.
This is backtracking a bit, but
Could you speak up a little?
this is backtracking a bit, but
Okay.
in the conversation with the rabbi, he talked about storytelling. I wasn't sure what he meant by storytelling.
You're not sure what he was talking about when he was referring to
Storytelling.
storytelling? Well, okay, so, Randy, if you were of a different race, okay, let's say you're African American, and I referred to, your mother and saying, your mother wears army boots. That doesn't make me a racist. Just calling a person a name doesn't create racism. It may create hatred and animosity towards, I'll pick on you because your mother wears army boots. What creates bigotry, racism, is when there were stories told about you or your mother or where your mother came from. That you're money grubbing. Your parents are nothing but interested but nothing but making money. That they are from an inferior group of people. You're not from Japheth, you're not Caucasian, you're from Shem, you're from Ham. You've been cursed by God. There's a story that's associated with your mother and your mother's people. Okay, that's what he's talking about. Racism comes with a storyline. And when we look at John, we have stories. And when you're telling that story, you're using the phrase, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. So when you're hearing the death of Jesus, an innocent, righteous man, And who's it because of? The story you're telling is the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. That then can develop, doesn't have to, but it unfortunately has, over time, created racism, bigotry, and there's a special term, anti-Semitism, that was coined in the 19th century to describe that. Does that answer your question about the story? Okay. And next week, maybe if I'll get into it a little bit more, how when we get into the Christian era, the majority of people through most of the, let's say in the Dark Ages, were illiterate. And how did they learn about the Bible? Well, a lot of times it was through art, through stained glass windows, through statues, through sermons, stories that are told. They don't have the Bible. They can't necessarily distinguish that, Matthew, Mark, and Luke doesn't use that term in a pejorative way, and John does. We are able to read the Bible, and we're able to distinguish and make these fine distinctions and keep ourselves away from being anti-Semitic. But stories that were being told through art, through sermons, and even just the political happenstance would be that storyline that would then lead to hatred toward the Jewish race. So we'll revisit this idea of a storyline next week. All right, so I just have a few more minutes. So anti-Judaism. I described what anti-Judaism is. What about if we stop and talk about what is Judaism? You can't be opposed to something if you don't even know what it is you're opposed to. So what is Judaism? Well, I kind of gave you the answer, a little bit of the answer when I was describing anti-Judaism. So the answer would be Judaism, in simple terms, is the Jewish way of living with regards to religion. The Jewish way of living with regards to religion is Judaism. And this way of living pertains to the calendar that one follows, what holy days one keeps, the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the language you speak, the songs you sing, how you raise your children. All of those things are part of a way of living. And the Jewish way of doing it is Judaism, the Jewish way of living. So if that is Judaism, anti-Judaism would be the opposition to all those things. It'd be opposition to the clothes you wear, the food you eat, the holy days you keep, the calendar you follow, how you raise your children. And you see how that applies to the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people use a different calendar, they worship, or they have different holy days, they have different dietary restrictions, they even have different rules on the clothes they can wear, and of course they raise their children, sing their songs, worship differently than everybody else. And I'm not just talking about Christians, but literally everybody else outside Judaism. So anti-Judaism is saying, I do not agree with the way that you live. I don't agree with the way that you live. Or to put it another way, anti-Judaism is saying that there is a better way to live than the way that the religious Jews have chosen for themselves. And that's what you see coming through in these passages in John 8, in 1 Thessalonians 2. There's a disagreement. This is a theological disagreement. The way of life that the Jewish people have chosen is being debated, being criticized, being critiqued. I don't like the way you live your life because a higher power tells me that there's a better way to live. That is anti-Judaism. Now, that is not anti-Semitism. You can be anti-Judaism and love the Jewish people. Ask the question, are Christadelphians anti-Semitic? I see Rob shaking his head. Are Christadelphians anti-Judaism? in a lot of ways. Well, I think you'd have to say almost all the ways, except for the fact we share the same holy book. If we weren't anti-Judaism, we wouldn't be in this building. We'd be, well, actually, today would be Sunday, so, but yesterday we would have been in synagogue, okay? So we're anti-Judaism, but we're not anti-Semitic, and we're clearly not anti-Zionists. So I hope that helps get nail down these terms, and they're necessary to then go forward to see how everything starts falling apart when we get into the 2nd century, and things just really fall apart. The wheels come off the bus as time progresses. So anyway, thank you for your attention. Anyone have any questions?